international settings. With respect to her credentials, Dr. Phillip is a board-certified family practice physician, as well as general preventative medicine and public health. Currently, she serves as the Deputy Director for Non-Infectious Diseases at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, known as the CDC, and is responsible for providing leadership and guidance to CDC's 4 non-infectious disease centers to advance priorities such as preventing prediabetes and diabetes, ending the opioid epidemic, reducing birth defects and developmental disabilities, as well as protecting the public's health from environmental hazards with a focus on achieving health equity. Soon after joining the CDC at the end of March 2020, Dr. Phillip was recruited to serve as a Deputy Incident Manager for CDC's COVID-19 response. She has spent several months in this role that included serving on a federal interagency data team. Pre-CDC, just prior to joining the CDC, Dr. Phillip served as health officer for the Sonoma County in California during a period of unprecedented response efforts, including the 2019 Kincaid fire, provision of health services for several hundred people, experiencing homelessness, and identification of the first cases of COVID-19 in the county. Her experience in Florida is very notable. So previously, Dr. Phillip spent 10 years with the Florida Department of Health, serving in numerous local and state capacities before being appointed by the Florida governor to serve as Florida's Surgeon General and Secretary of Health from 2016 to 2018. As Chief Executive of the department, she was responsible for over 13,000 full-time employees and a $3 billion annual budget. Dr. Phillip led the state's efforts to limit local transmission of the Zika virus in South Florida and oversaw the state's public health and medical efforts during Hurricanes Hermine, Matthew, Irma, Nate, and Michael. She chaired the state health improvement planning process with over 30 partner organizations who identified achieving health equity as the overarching theme and coordinated multi-agency efforts to address challenging issues such as opioid overdose, prevention, and treatment. She secured legislative approval to streamline state HIV funding to support key HIV prevention strategies. And under her direction, every county health department in Florida began providing pre-exposure prophylaxis, a major accomplishment in the state at that time. As a result of her strong relationships with partners, the department was awarded a grant from the John A. Hartford Foundation to collaborate with Trust for America's Health and partners such as AARP, the Florida Department of Elder Affairs, and the area agencies on aging to create a novel public health framework to support healthy aging in communities, one of the first in the nation. Her degrees and awards are as follows. Dr. Phillip received a bachelor's degree from Howard University, magna cum laude in Washington, D.C., and both a master's of public health degree in maternal and child health and a Doctor of Medicine degree from Loma Linda University. She completed a family medicine residency at Florida Hospital in Orlando and trained at CDC as an Epidemic Intelligence Service Officer and Preventative Medicine resident while being a commissioned officer of the U.S. Public Health Service. Dr. Phillip was the 2016 University of South Florida's College of Public Health Outstanding Woman in Public Health, accepted an honorary doctorate from Nova Southeastern University in 2018, was named the 2019 Loma Linda University School of Public Health Alumnus of the Year, and received the inaugural American Cancer Society Southeast Region Impact Award in 2019. I am proud and honored to present to you today another of our daughters, Dr. Celeste Phillip. Her topic is Equipped to Defeat COVID-19, Vaccines, Masks, Vigilance, Gratefulness, and more. Dr. Celeste, the time is yours. Her sound is not coming through, Ashley.
As you can tell, Pastor, I'm one of his many children, and he asked me for my long bio, so he could brag a little bit. So I apologize for that, but it was also very humbling to hear you say those words. So thank you for that and for the invitation to be here with you all this evening. You know, I'm here as a public health physician, and in public health, data and science must inform our recommendations. But those recommendations only work, they're only effective if we can communicate in ways that are clear, in ways that resonate with people and allow them to feel empowered to follow those recommendations. And that is why I am here tonight, not really to share anything new, but wanting to summarize what we know at this point in the pandemic, and then have the opportunity for our conversation, for me to be able to try to answer any questions that you may have. And if I do not know the answers, as Dr. Fauci said recently, for some of you may have seen this press conference, if we don't know, we say we don't know, we don't guess. So I'm really honored to be here tonight with you all. 1 year has passed since the first cases of COVID-19 were confirmed in the US. 1 year ago, and yet I would say that we are still in the middle of difficult and challenging times. I know we have all been saddened by this pandemic in some way. For some of us, it might be the disruption to our lives, having to work and school, maybe the whole household together from home every day, which can be very challenging. I happen to live alone, but I live in an apartment building. And there are some days where I'm trying to have a meeting like we're having now, and it's hard to concentrate, and you feel distracted. And over time, those little things can start to bother you and wear on you. But I know we also all know someone, either directly in our social network, our loved ones, or people that we know, many within church members, church family, that have lost someone close to them because of COVID-19. So sometimes it feels tiring to hear the numbers. We are now at almost 25 million cases in the US. On some days, we hear of thousands of people dying. Just in the last few weeks, there were several days in a row where it was 3,000, 4,000 people dying in one day. And those numbers, again, sometimes you start to become desensitized because it feels overwhelming. But for those of us that have lost loved ones, it's very personal. Just this past week, I had a close friend from med school from Loma Linda whose grandmother passed away from COVID. And just yesterday, a colleague at CDC who lost her father. None of us are immune to this. Those of us that are healthcare workers, public health experts, it doesn't matter. We all still have to remain vigilant, which is part of the message. So as we are reminded that even with something as promising as a vaccine, this vigilance of staying aware of our surroundings and making sure that we are staying distant, that we, as we're losing loved ones, we're having to grieve differently. I really want to talk about how we are able to get through that each day, how we are here to support each other. There is not any magic to this, even with the vaccine. Much of what we have to do to protect ourselves and our loved ones really needs to continue. You know, I was thinking about a year ago, and Pastor mentioned Zika, and that was another novel threat to the US. Even though Zika had been around, been first identified in 1957, we hadn't seen spread very much outside of Uganda where it was first identified. But when we are dealing with these novel infectious agents, there is so much that we don't know and difficult to predict. Even Dr. Fauci, who, when we look back at some of his earliest comments, a lot of uncertainty. When I first heard of this cluster of unknown pneumonia cases out of Wuhan, China, then we started hearing it looks like it's related, it's a SARS coronavirus. And many of you may recall SARS from several years ago, that was a very fatal disease, about 40% mortality rate. So we were concerned about that, but then also that outbreak was pretty limited. It was a small geographic scope and it was time limited. So initially, I think many people, including myself, when we heard that there's a new coronavirus, we were hoping it would be something similar, maybe with a lower mortality rate, but not this global pandemic that we are now facing. And with those unknowns, there sometimes can be some shifts in guidance. So early on, there was a lot of discussion about masks. And initially the thought was, well, masks have some utility, but we thought initially that it was really to protect those around us. And that certainly was true. But as we learned more, as we looked at more data, as there were studies conducted in laboratory settings with devices that could simulate a cough or a sneeze with these masks on the devices, we were able to show between these devices that the wearer is also protected. And so that shift, I remember, you know, it seems like a lifetime ago, but when that language, when the recommendations were updated to say, we think it now protects everyone, so the wearer as well. You know, that was another example of some confusion and potentially could have contributed to some groups saying, I'm not wearing a mask, I don't think it really works. But those are the areas that we have to be thoughtful about and really take the time to understand so that we can make informed decisions. And this goes back to my point about whether we are communicating that effectively in a way that people can understand and then say, I'm going to wear a mask because what the data that's been shared makes sense to me and I know it can protect myself and my family. So as this pandemic was unfolding, and we started to see that this was not like the first SARS, and for those of you who might be familiar with seeing SARS-CoV-2, that 2, which is the name of the virus, that 2 signifies that this is the second SARS coronavirus that's related to that first one. So we started then to see that this was different and trying to predict how it might spread, who might be higher risk. Just like with the flu virus, we know that older adults in general have higher risk for those kinds of infections. So we started seeing that indeed we were seeing more older adults that were being impacted. Similarly, we would expect that there would likely be an increased risk for people that have underlying chronic conditions that can affect your immune system. And that includes conditions like diabetes, as well as heart disease, that maybe don't seem like they directly impact your immune system, but they do, unfortunately. We started to see that as well. We saw people, and we were really trying to message that if you have an underlying health condition, a chronic condition, to take extra precautions. But then we started seeing that there were groups of people, communities that were having a disproportionate amount of severe disease. People who were getting very sick, having to be hospitalized. And in those early days, before there was a better awareness of different options for management, people were getting intubated almost immediately. And it became overwhelming in some parts of the country, certainly in New York, but we started seeing it in other places. And when we started to try to understand who were these people, and we all know this now, but the rate for severe disease amongst communities of color, Black Americans, Latino communities, Native Americans, 2 to 4 times the rate of white Americans consistently. Some of that risk can be tied to these underlying health conditions that I mentioned. Some of it can be tied to the types of employment, the essential workers, people who have to be on the front lines that didn't have the option to try to work from home or to work remotely. There are also cultural factors for many of us. My parents are from India. Multi-generational households are very common. And we see that a lot in the United States with folks from all over. And so some of those factors also made a difference. And actually my parents live with my sister and her family and her kids. So they are an example of a 3-generation household. So some of those factors can explain some of these differences. But we know that much of the reason for the disparities are related to longstanding historical disparities in health, wealth, and opportunity. And I think we should feel encouraged that we're seeing from the Biden administration some efforts to have some long-term impact to these longstanding limitations and the historical injustices in this country. But that's the long game. And so for now, I'm here to remind us about what we know what is happening. We know that these risks are there. So a reminder for all of us, and I include myself when I say all of us, of what we need to do to remain vigilant and to develop our own resiliency so that we can get through this next period. So I want to talk a little bit about, I guess I'm calling them three buckets of considerations for us. And, I referenced before that in the beginning, the care in hospitals, there was a lot of unknowns about the right protocols and what are the different kinds of therapies. And we do have some experimental therapies that have been approved by the FDA, and they are making a difference. People are surviving severe illness and able to return home. But I want to remind us of this idea of what is being called long COVID, that there are some people, and I had an opportunity to hear Dr. Smith speak to you all in the last couple of weeks. Some of those mistakes that happen in hospitals when people are stressed and tired. Now that we have a vaccine, this is another consideration for all of us, because to the extent that we know that they are very effective, if we are able to vaccinate for ourselves, for our community, but really also for our healthcare system, that is a way to relieve the stress that hospitals and healthcare workers all over are feeling. And also for yourself to eliminate or greatly decrease the chances of you having to be hospitalized and in a system where there's the potential for some of these mistakes to be made. Also wanted to remind us, and I know you had another nice, very thorough presentation by Dr. Webley. So I know you've heard the science behind the vaccines, but just to highlight a couple of key points, these types of vaccines, the 2 that have been approved so far, the Pfizer, BioNTech, and then the Moderna, are these mRNA vaccines that are newer. That is why we were able to, within under a year, go from planning to all of the clinical trials to manufacture to getting the vaccines into people's arms. And similar to recommendations that don't mean anything if they're on a piece of paper or on a screen, a vaccine doesn't mean anything until it is in the arm and into the system of individuals. So just another reminder of or reassurance of why we got here so quickly. If you are in a category where you are offered a vaccine, and I know in Florida, there is an opportunity. Florida was a bit ahead of other states to say we want to offer vaccination for people 65 and older. Regardless, if you are a Florida resident, if you are in a county, and I did not look at vaccine numbers by county, but if you are in a position to get scheduled, vaccination at this point is the most effective prevention mechanism that we have. And you've probably heard over and over, while we are trying to achieve that herd immunity, so that means 75% plus of individuals that have full immunity from the vaccine. And I say full immunity because right now these two vaccines require 2 doses, but there are other vaccines that are in the pipeline that might require only one dose. But until we are at that point where we have a large population in this country vaccinated, wearing your masks, still critical, trying to avoid large crowds, especially in indoor settings. And it's a relative term now, what large crowd means. Now it could be 10 people in a living room, that might be too many people. So being aware that you need to keep that 6 feet of distance between each other at a minimum, still very important. And then of course, as always, washing your hands frequently. That one should never go away. And I'm hoping that one of the silver linings of this entire experience for all of us is that that particular habit will be ingrained in us, because that will prevent lots of other infections down the road. So that first bucket is what I would call the public health actions. The next, I would say, is the self-preservation and resiliency that we need to remain vigilant. And for those who have grown up in the church or understand the principles, the health principles, this is a blessing in that this is part of what we grew up hearing. Lots of rest, and there's now science behind it, which makes me so happy, because I remember as a kid hearing these things, and when you're young, everything sounds boring, right? But we can now say that there is science behind these recommendations. So getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night boosts your immunity. The foods that you put into your body should be mostly plant-based. I will not make a comment about the Wendy's certificates, because I know you can get salads. That was already pointed out. Thank you. But everything in moderation. But a mostly plant-based diet with variety will allow you to have all of those nutrients, those vitamins, the antioxidants that will promote your immune system to function as well as possible. And then, of course, drinking lots of water, staying hydrated, and getting activity. And right now with COVID, that might mean it's hard for you to get outside, but there are things that you can do in your house, staying busy, doing chores, or doing a set of push-ups or planking, or being able to use, if you don't have weights in your house, and they don't have to be terribly heavy, but taking canned foods and using those to lift weights. All of those kinds of activities, even in short amounts, help to keep your overall immune system as well as your wellness intact. But if you can go outside, the benefits of being in nature, exposure to sunshine, even if they're short walks, can make a huge difference for how you feel and also how it helps you to stay healthy. So that's the second bucket. The last is an example. We're actually doing it right now. It's connecting, feeling like you are a part of a group, that you matter, and that you have purpose. We've seen lots of stories. You may know people who are having a lot of difficulties from a mental health perspective, feeling anxious, feeling stressed, feeling like, when is this going to end? How do we get through this? What do I do? And, again, not a magic solution. It's up to all of us to be aware of how we're we are feeling ourselves, but also for those in our social circles. There might be some people who, because of lots of different reasons, they are pretty much homebound and they don't have that ability to connect with people. So what we're doing right now, if you're able to do, even if it's a phone call, or if you're able to do some kind of video call, or I've seen a lot of these, I haven't been able to participate in one yet, but I hope I can, you know, these drive-by celebrations. During graduation, I saw in the neighborhood I live in Atlanta, that there were teachers who were driving through certain neighborhoods where there were a lot of kids from their school as a way of celebrating. I've seen videos of drive-by birthday parties for people that I know in all over the country. So you can do those kind, you know, we have to continue those kinds of efforts, even though I know it's not the same, but it's a way to make sure that the people you love feel cared for, feel connected. And the act of service is also tied to your own immunity and sense of calm. There are endorphins that are released when you give to others. So again, it's just a beautiful thing to see that all of this ties together in terms of what we believe because of our faith, but now knowing that there's science to back up all of these benefits. So those were all of my opening comments. And again, very grateful to be able to spend this time with you. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now. I don't know if any have started coming in yet, but.
While we wait on the questions to come in the chat box, I have some questions for you. So you spoke a little bit about herd immunity, and we hear a lot of talk about herd immunity, and I've even heard arguments that we should loosen up restrictions to allow for herd immunity by infection. And now we're talking about like herd immunity in terms of the vaccine. So has the CDC computed what the death toll would be to achieve herd immunity by infection? And how does that compare to immunity as a result of the vaccine?
So that is an excellent question. I think there are a number of components in there. So let me address a couple and then you let me know if I've left out any. So thank you for raising the question of herd immunity as a result of infections and herd immunity as a result of vaccinations, because they are very different. And there was a few months ago, this idea that if we just stopped all of our mitigation efforts, all of these protective steps that we're trying to take, that people would be exposed and then have antibodies as a result of the infection, and that this would all go away. When you look at, and I don't know the exact answer to how many deaths that would have resulted in to get to that point, but you know, when we look at our current numbers, and this is 3 to 4 weeks into vaccination, but we're almost at 25 million cases, over 400,000 deaths, with the concern that we will get to 500,000 deaths much quicker, partially because of holiday travel and exposures in large gatherings there, but also because we are seeing these variants, and that's not something I talked about, but we are seeing that there are a couple of variants where there's some mutations in the virus that so far we don't know for sure that they are increasing the death rate. So more people will not die because it's a more virulent variant at this point, but we're seeing that it's more transmissible. So if we had 100 people before that were being exposed to the original strain of COVID, and 10 people became ill, with these new variants, it might be more like 20 to 30 people becoming ill. And if more people are becoming ill and the death rate remains the same, that means more people will become severely ill, hospitalized, and likely to die. So I guess I would say, just looking at those numbers, I don't think anyone in public health would find it acceptable to say, that's okay, that's what we're going to recommend. Now with the vaccine, the concept of herd immunity in terms of a lot of people in a population having antibodies to protect them from the disease, that concept is the same. And the antibodies that are generated as a result of a vaccination are much more consistent because the dose is the same. And that is why those studies are needed to calculate how effective they are, to be able to measure the levels of antibodies, et cetera. And so that's why we can say with confidence that if we get to 75% of the population and above, we should start to see significant decreases in the number of cases over time. So I'm not sure if I answered all of your questions. If there's something else, please let me know.
That answers the question. We have some questions in the chat. The first one says, if you were to move someone along the path from vaccine hesitancy to comfort level, what would that progression look like?
Boy, if I knew the answer to that, we'd be in a very different place. You know, vaccines are surprisingly complicated topic. And I say that because, I say growing up, but being trained in public health, it is one of the top 10 accomplishments in the last century for public health. Vaccinations and sanitation actually are the two accomplishments that have decreased morbidity and mortality or sickness and death the most of anything else, even more than antibiotics and other more modern treatments. But what happens is, years and years and generations later, after you don't see the effects of those vaccine preventable diseases, I think it's easy to then start to say those diseases were gone. I don't really think we need to be vaccinated anymore because nobody has it, so I'm not going to get it because it's not out there. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And, we went for many years without having any cases of measles because our MMR vaccination rate was very high. And then we started to see drop-offs in the MMR rates amongst children. And then we started seeing that there were outbreaks in certain parts of the country, certain other countries as well. And, measles can cause very severe illness. But it was because we hadn't seen it for so long, and because most cases are pretty mild, that it created this false sense of security, I would say. So, depending on your background and your comfort level with maybe starting the conversation in that way to say, we forgot about it because they were so effective. And now that we have this opportunity for a vaccine, it's something that we should all really think about. And again, the benefits to yourself, to your loved ones. If you get vaccinated, you can now, keep your mask on again, but now you can feel more comfort in running errands. You can run errands for loved ones that maybe haven't been vaccinated yet and feel a greater sense of security with what you're doing. And the other benefits I mentioned to the healthcare system, and I know many of you are healthcare workers, and so you know firsthand what it is doing to not just the COVID care, but the other care that's been delayed because there's not capacity. Scheduled surgeries have had to be postponed. And actually talking about vaccinations, childhood vaccinations for school entry, we are concerned because so many kids have been homeschooled and there's not homeschooled, but learning remotely. And because some of those visits have been delayed, that next year we might start to see some of these other outbreaks from vaccine preventable diseases. So there's a constellation of effects to our healthcare system because of COVID. So there are these other benefits for vaccination that we should highlight, and thinking through some of those broader impacts that we will be able to return to our, I talked about not having our sense of normalcy. the sooner we get to that high vaccination rate, that herd immunity, we can start to resume some of our normal activities and do things in person again. We might still need to be a little more cautious, but that's really the only way that we're going to get back to the way we were living. I think some of the changes with COVID have been blessings in disguise or surprising, but so much of what we do, we want to get back to, and without having enough people vaccinated, that's just not going to be possible.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. A couple of weeks ago, when Dr. Webley was here, he touched on the topic of natural herbs and treatments and things like that. And while it may ease our personal concerns, he did say that there's no evidence that supports the use of natural herbs to treat COVID-19. So this question is asking, what are your thoughts on that?
So particularly in the US, and I've only lived in the US, but I know in general, the way we define evidence or evidence-based is very stringent. So, you know, when I talked about having a healthful diet with a lot of, you know, plant-based with a lot of variety, you know, that was really meant to keep you healthy. If you have already been diagnosed, and to decrease your risk for severe illness. If you've already been diagnosed with COVID, at this point, we don't have evidence to say taking these particular herbs, drinking this tea, changing your diet will be enough to successfully treat COVID. It certainly can't hurt to try to do some of those things if you haven't been already. But the other medical treatments will be necessary. And again, in the vein of why vaccination is so important, I would, even though all these things that you can do to stay healthy are, I would continue to recommend, that would not take the place of vaccination either. And you know, the other thing I will offer, I think in the United States, we're starting to see a shift, but historically, the amount of research invested in understanding the role of herbs for treatment or prevention has been limited. We're starting to see that more researchers are looking at that. Vitamin D is one example. Specifically, in the UK, they're recommending vitamin D supplementation for some communities that are higher risk. In the US, the level of evidence that is required to make that recommendation does not exist yet. But there have been some discussions to promote that kind of research so that we do have better data to help us answer those questions in the future.
Thank you. We have another question that says, is Bell's palsy a side effect? People have reported this, however, the CDC website reports occurrences during the trial, but says it was not caused by the vaccine. How can we be sure?
So this is a great opportunity for me to talk a little bit about the system to monitor adverse events from vaccination. There is an existing long-standing system called the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or VAERS. And we've been trying to emphasize and encourage as much as possible for people, if you have any side effects, to please either, you can report directly as an individual, or you can go through your healthcare provider for them to, once you notify them if you've had any kind of reaction, for them to enter it into the system. So I want to first say that there is a very concrete way for that information to be shared. And we have gotten lots of entries into the VAERS system for COVID since the vaccinations have started. So with any kind of adverse reaction, and Bell's palsy, as Ashley stated, was noted during some of the trials, there has to be an assessment of the timing of vaccination to the adverse event, whatever that might be. And then also looking at what we call the baseline levels of certain conditions. and seeing if it looks like it's an aberration or higher than what you would normally expect. Bell's palsy occurs not infrequently with certain viral infections in general, or a post-viral infection. So it's sometimes difficult to say with certainty it was a direct result of the vaccination versus some other exposure that may have occurred. With Bell's palsy, most people, and some people do have long-standing droopiness and residual symptoms, but most people, it does resolve after some time. I have a couple of close friends that went through Bell's palsy a few years ago. So they shared with me how challenging it was, because people were like, did you have a stroke? You're so young, what happened? So I don't mean to minimize that potential, if there is a relationship, to say that we should just ignore it or blow it off. And I know that sometimes is why people are hesitant to get vaccinated. But what I would offer is to say, that is something that tends to be term limited. It will resolve. It doesn't have severe implications to your health compared to the risk for severe illness with COVID, which is a different story. The long COVID that I referenced earlier, for some people who had mild illness, and actually there are some people who were asymptomatic. Later on, they're describing these strange symptoms they're having, feeling fatigue, feeling achiness. There have been, in some athletes, identification of cardiac effects for people who had mild illness. And these are some are professional athletes. Some of the initial cases where we were seeing the myositis after infection were in very well-trained elite athletes. So we just don't know, and we don't know what any of us, what our exposure would lead to, what kind of illness and what kind of longer term effects. So just, keeping all of that in mind when thinking about some of these potential adverse reactions that are time limited and can go away versus the risk of COVID.
Speaking of side effects and adverse reactions, we have a question that says, for those who have had COVID and have taken the vaccine, have you heard of the side effects such as body aches and headaches being amplified?
I have a number of friends who are healthcare workers and have received both doses, as well as some older adults who've had the opportunity. And it's varied. Some people have said, didn't really feel very much at all, a little soreness at the site, a little tired. And then I've had a couple of people that I've spoken to who've said they've had a mild fever and they've had more achiness, and it took them a couple of days to get over those symptoms. So there is that range of potential responses to the vaccine. But as we say, that means it's working in your system. So hopefully you can rest or do other things to kind of get through that initial period.
Thank you. We have another question that says, does the vaccine assist with protection from the new strain? Reports show that it has only been tested on the new strain in the lab and not on people.
That is a big question on everyone's minds. And so far in those lab studies, it appears that it is still effective. But there are studies that are currently undergoing to see what happens in real life. So there's in vitro, which is in the lab, and then in vivo, which is in people and out in the world. So we're hoping to have some information about that in the near future. But so far, it looks like it will be effective. Yet another reason for us to, if you have an opportunity to get vaccinated, because as more people get vaccinated, that then reduces the options for the virus to transmit to other people. That helps us to reduce the risk for more mutations and more of these variants to come into circulation. So it actually is another benefit that we could see if we increase our vaccination rates.
We have another question that says, I am a school teacher and very concerned that many of the guidelines are lacking, especially in the classroom itself because of space. What is the data showing where children are concerned and their ability to transmit the virus, but showing no symptoms? Several teachers have had the virus already.
Yes, I share the concerns about the potential risk for teachers and understand that's been a very difficult decision. I have a lot of friends that are teachers, and in some jurisdictions, a decision was made, some districts, school districts, a decision was made to not open, to do all virtual learning. And in others, that was not the case. And, you know, we've talked a lot about the risk for children, that most children do not have severe illness, although there are some that do. But it's, you know, also equally important for the adults that are in those settings, teachers and other faculty members and other facility team members. So overall, the levels of transmission within school-aged children where there has been in-person, in-classroom learning have mirrored what we've seen in the community versus rates in college age and older students. Their rates increased before we saw the levels increase in the community. So we were able to show that relationship, that time relationship, that because the rates were going up a few weeks to several weeks in advance to the community rates increasing, that likely older students, college students, were having exposures and some of their activities and bringing it into the community. Versus in younger children, we saw that their rates really mirrored what was happening in the community at the same time. So that tells us that they were not contributing to increasing rates, but if there is some transmission happening in a classroom that mirrors what is happening in the community, that's not reassuring to a teacher. So the recommendations for how to protect students and teachers in in-person settings, you know, tries to lay out wearing masks, having this space within the classroom, operating in pods where you have smaller numbers of students and alternating. So maybe Monday and Wednesday, it's one group of students or one pod. And then Tuesday, Thursday, it's a different group, smaller group, but as a way to try to limit if there is exposure that happens, fewer people being involved. So it would only be 10 versus 20 or 30. So those are some of the strategies that have been recommended. And I know it's not possible to follow them in every case. Some of you may have been following that there is going to be likely a lot of revisions to guidelines with the new administration. So I would say stay tuned to see what will come out of that.
Thank you. We have another question that says, the South African strain of the virus is said to be very different from the other in the UK. Are the vaccines able to prevent contraction or reinfection? And if you are reinfected with this strain, is the severity decreased?
So there is more data with the UK variant. With South Africa, I think those studies are still underway to understand how different, how it might impact immunization differently. So far with and it's a very small number of confirmed reinfections. And when I say confirmed, it's not, oh, I had a positive test and then I had a negative test and then I had a positive test again. The people who are in that category of confirmed reinfections, there's been an ability to do whole genomic sequencing of the initial viral strain and compare it to this same sequencing for a specimen that was taken after the potential reinfection. And scientists were able to see that, oh, no, there has been enough of a change where this is a separate variant. So those numbers of people so far have been small, but we have to acknowledge that that whole genome sequencing is not available everywhere. And so the numbers are likely higher than what we think they are. But so far from those limited cases, we've not seen that there has been more severe disease, but we also can't say that it's protective either. This idea, and that speaks to some of this idea of the herd immunity, because we were starting to see reinfections, even though small numbers. And with coronaviruses in general, there are coronaviruses that circulate every year. The natural immunity from antibodies from those exposures tend to not last for many years. So that was another reason that there is some concern, and really why it's important for vaccination to provide the antibodies that are likely to persist longer, but we're still also having to do studies to see how long that protection might last. And you may have heard that there have been discussions about we might need a booster down the road. So those are still questions that we have.
Speaking of reinfection, we have a question here that says, if someone already has contracted COVID, what is the chance of them contracting it again?
So that is a complicated equation and would have to do with much of what we've talked about tonight. So your risk in general to start with will depend on some of those protective measures that you're taking, as well as those around you. And again, acknowledging, depending on your occupation, your living situation, we've seen a number of, for a period, there was a lot of transmission that was occurring within household members. We know that's very difficult if one person is infected. Depending on when you're notified, you may not have the time to try to distance within the household, or you may not have the ability. When I spoke about multi-generational households, in some cases that means people have less space as well. So those are some of the realities of making it difficult to eliminate risk or minimize risk if those are some of the situations. But if the question is also speaking to, will antibodies from a previous infection protect me? Some of that will depend on the dose of your initial exposure and how many antibodies you produced, how long they may persist. And there's a lot of variation there. And that's some of what we're still trying to understand. So I think it'd be difficult now to quantify, what level of, or what percentage of risk you would have. But that is why it is important to continue in the message of vigilance that even this prior infection and even with vaccination, we're saying it's a 95% efficacy. There's still 5%. You need at least 2 weeks after your second dose to have what we think will be the full benefits. But again, that's not 100% either. So that's why all of these protective measures are so important to continue.
We have a question that speaks about how, of course, we hear that, different people have different levels of severity when they receive if they contract COVID. Some people don't have any symptoms at all. So has there been a correlation between getting severely ill as you age, or is it almost random?
We have certainly seen more severe illness in older adults, as well as individuals who maybe are younger but have those underlying health conditions like diabetes. I mentioned diabetes and heart disease, but chronic kidney disease, cancer, other lung conditions. There is a list on the COVID-19 website on CDC's site that lists all of the different underlying factors that increase your risk for severe disease that have solid evidence. There's also another category where there might be fewer cases. So it's a little bit lower level of risk, but still increased over the general population. And as we are learning more about different conditions, because some conditions are rare, so we don't have enough numbers to build that evidence base to say with certainty. But I will also mention that sickle cell disease is another condition that increases your risk in that top tier of highest risk.
We had another question that was asking, in terms of the vaccine, people who tend to have increased risk, people who have heart disease or diabetes or things like this. Will they experience more severe symptoms with the vaccine?
Sorry, I muted myself because I'm hearing some noise from neighbors. I couldn't unmute myself. So far, the most immediate highest risk from vaccination is what we call anaphylaxis, which is a severe immune response that can compromise your breathing, can be very severe. Some people require hospitalization, going into the ICU, intubation for respiratory support. The cases that we've seen so far, and there have been a handful with the, we're now at over 20 million doses administered. But for the first, I'd say it's probably about half of that, we saw about, I believe it was between 20 and 30 cases of anaphylaxis, and some were quite severe. They tended to be actually mostly women between the ages of 20 and 50, and underlying conditions were not predominant, but a history of allergy, and a number did have a previous episode of anaphylaxis. Those were the individuals that seemed to have the highest risk of having that kind of adverse reaction to the vaccine, but not with other underlying conditions.
Thank you. We have another question that says, how much of the skepticism around the vaccine can be traced to the speed of development and the inconsistency of some of the information coming out of the CDC? And can we expect that as time goes on, the skepticism will die down?
I'm sorry, can you hear me now? It's
Yes.
a bad habit of working from home where you mute yourself when you stop talking. So my apologies. If there are participants who would like to share with me offline, if you see information that appears to be confusing on the website, I would love to hear that, because we've gotten to a point where there's so much information. As you're trying to update, sometimes older information doesn't get removed and it can be confusing. So if you have a specific website or example, but in general, now I think I forgot the other part of the question.
Can we expect the skepticism as time goes on and more people receive the vaccine to die down?
I hope the answer is yes. And I understand, because before this happening, it's been years to have a new vaccine go through all of these phases and be available. So I'm hoping as more people have opportunities to hear about the mRNA technology, some of the other vaccine products that are in development rely on pre-existing mechanisms. So there might be some people who feel more comfortable knowing this is not a new technology. If they're further down in the queue anyway and waiting, they might feel more comfortable with that. And I certainly think people need to feel comfortable before making a decision to proceed. But what I want to say now is to reassure what we've seen so far, these vaccines are safe. It's new. Anything new always takes some getting used to. But as I mentioned, we are at 20 million. We are on track for and aiming for 1 million per day, if not more. So if production can keep up and we can get distribution and all of these sites in states, we'll have a lot more data to be able to look at and to then continue to share what we know. And I am hopeful that it will be reassuring to people who still have concerns because it's new.
Thank you. We have another question that says, it is my understanding that the vaccine does not necessarily protect against transmission and contraction, but it makes you less likely to get severely ill. So is that true?
It is, so that is a very nuanced question from someone who clearly understands the data. The short answer is the primary endpoint in the studies was looking at severe illness, not necessarily whether or not there was actual evidence of infection, be that asymptomatic or otherwise. So there are now studies following on to be able to answer that question, to be able to say, we don't just think that you have undetectable disease or undetectable virus, but we think that it's actually preventing you from contracting the illness, being exposed, is now allowing you to be asymptomatic carrier or someone who could infect others. So there is research being done now to be able to answer those questions.
So we have another question that says, I got the COVID test using the rapid test, but it is what the WHO has recently declared people are getting false negative results. So what are your thoughts on these rapid tests? Do you believe that they're good indicators of whether or not you have COVID?
So we could have a long discussion on where it's appropriate to use those rapid tests versus the PCR viral tests. It depends on the setting. It depends on whether you're trying to, like in university settings, those rapid antigen tests are being used to test a large volume of students on a regular basis. And it's allowing them to have more timely information. And in that setting, it makes sense. In a setting where you have a higher prevalence or there's more disease that's circulating, it can help you to, if you have a negative test, that's usually pretty good to say it is negative. But if you are in a community where you have lower levels, and it's a strange concept, I have to say, if you haven't heard it over and over, but that the underlying level of disease in a community affects the way that a test performs. So you would have to consider it with a lot of those factors in mind. And I think it would require talking with someone in a local setting who understands the epidemiology of what's happened, of transmission in that particular area.
We have another question that says, there have been reports of at least 2 people who have died after receiving the vaccine. Both had not any previously known medical conditions. Has the CDC investigated that, and is there any information on it?
So that is something that I don't have direct knowledge of. So I think that would be an example of me not trying to answer that question.
Okay, thank you. Our last question, if no one else puts any more in the chat, we have just one more. So with the recent rollouts of the vaccine, we've seen a lot of inequity to the point that we see a lot of like vaccine tourism, people coming in from different states and different places to get a vaccine. So is the CDC involved at all in addressing the inequity in vaccine distribution throughout the country?
Up to this point, the recommendations for who should be prioritized for vaccination come from an Advisory Council on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. So that is the group that looks at the data for efficacy of a vaccine, looks at the patterns of transmission, and then also has that lens of, in which groups do we need to try to prevent disease the fastest? And so that is why healthcare workers and individuals living in long-term care settings, congregate settings, were prioritized. And these are recommendations. So there is not an oversight or regulatory aspect to those recommendations. And that is why actually in Florida, and I'm not a spokesperson for Florida anymore, but I know that the tiered approach where individuals 65 and older, it may have taken longer based on the ACIP recommendations, that in Florida, there was an offer for people sooner than that tier. And that demonstrates that in the end, it is up to states to make the determination about the best way to allocate. And in Florida, the demographics are different. And I think it made a lot of sense from that perspective. Now, the idea of people coming into a state like Florida because of that, I know that has created some problems. And my understanding is that there's going to be a shift, if it hasn't already happened, where you'll have to prove residence in Florida, even if it's part-time, for you to be eligible if you're 65 and older. And again, that is something that is up to states. Thus far, with the new president, new administration, some of that might change. But in the United States, there are a lot of rights and authorities that states have. And so many of the decisions often are at the state level.
Okay, thank you. That was our last question. So I just want to thank Dr. Phillip for being here with us this afternoon and for answering all of our questions. I know we all very much enjoyed it and it was very informative. And at this time, I'm going to hand over to Pastor so that he can close up for us.
Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Dr. Celeste. I am very appreciative of your coming and sharing with us and certainly answering all of these questions. We were seeking for a doctor who would speak to us from a point of heart and care, and at the same time, be profited by experience from where you sit at the CDC and your years of other related experience in dealing with disease. I'm thankful that we were able to get to you, and I'm thankful that you responded in kind and were able to answer these questions for those of us who have concerns about the difficulties of taking the vaccine, given the mental set, given the hesitancy for African American, Latino groups over the years, and looking for some confidence levels and information to have us create an informed decision going forward. I know at this time that it's difficult to get a vaccine in certain areas. The sites fill up very quickly, and I'm not sure how many of our congregation in that category have been vaccinated. But our intent here is not to tell people whether or not they should be vaccinated, because we want to have people like you indicate the viability of such, the good sense about that, and also be able to help us to ferret the questions around it. And certainly people are concerned about side effects and what's the nature of side effects. So if there's one last question I would need to ask, it is this. When we refer to small numbers, could you quantify what that means when we look at reactions, side effects in terms of small numbers? In the large schemes of things, what type of percentage would reflect a small number of negative response and therefore difficulties?
That is such a good question that there's no good answer to it.
Okay.
This has come up quite a bit. And, you know, if you think about it, most of the vaccinations that have been around or that are offered are for particular groups. So we have the childhood vaccinations. We have certain vaccinations that require a booster, like tetanus. Then as you get older, we have the shingles vaccine, the pneumococcal to prevent pneumonia. We have the annual flu vaccine, but the annual flu vaccine, we've never really had large numbers. So now we're talking about a vaccine. I mean, right now it's only been approved, you know, the Pfizer BioNTech has been approved for 16 and above. Moderna is 18 and above. We don't have a vaccine yet for children. But when you look at the goal of saying we want to vaccinate all adults, we don't have an equivalent of this kind of scenario to be able to compare numbers and to be able to quantify in that way. But in general, you know, if the adverse reactions are, you know, very, very, very small, and this is an area where I should not guess because it's not been defined, but you know, less than 1% of the total number, and that will change because the denominator or the total number of people every day, it's changing. Like I said, we're on track for 1 million per day. It will take time for us to be able to update those numbers. Probably every few weeks, there'll be a new analysis looking at adverse reactions and trying to explain, and especially for anaphylaxis, which is the most severe. So I'd say stay tuned. The goal is to share information as quickly as possible as we learn more. But I can tell you from the data we have so far, the concerns about the percentage, the numbers, the types of reactions is consistent with what we've seen with other vaccines. I wish it were zero for all of these treatments, but it's not. You know, any medical treatment, there are risks, benefits, and alternatives. There's risk with everything, unfortunately. But based on what we know so far, we feel like it is safe, and that when you weigh the risk of the disease, we are highly recommending vaccination for everyone who is eligible.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I trust that our membership here, those who are in attendance, have been benefited. I know that they have, and we really would appreciate a further dialogue somewhere down the road as things get very different, as the vaccine is more prolific, and we can be certain of that. And as we reach that place of herd immunity, and I think that's a 75% marker, if I remember that correctly. We're thankful to you so much. And I wish you success, continued success in your work and at the CDC. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to just pause to say this, that Andrews University is hosting a session on the 28th, that is next Thursday at 4:30 by Dr. Kismikaya Corbett from I think she was involved in vaccine development. And there's a link that people who are interested, I don't know if Ashley could put it out there for me, but it's a 982, tell me when you're ready. You can write that down, 98288823271 link. It's just the same like ours. You go right on and you're on. You don't need a password. And I've been asked to help to promote this. Some of you have heard that name. Dr. Philip, I think you know that name. Can you make a comment on that?
I don't know her personally, but okay. I have seen her interviewed, and I know she played a role with developing some of the science behind the mRNA mechanism. Yes. So I'm looking forward to joining that too.
Okay, great. Yes. All right. I want to thank a number of our guests this evening and some of our members who are abroad. I see the Welches on, and I want to say hello to you. And of course, good to see you in there in Central America. Also, our usual Miss Espy, I see my friend Vida on, and my brother's wife, the New York crew. And I see Dr. Rutherford, and good to see Sister Rose again this evening. Norma from Canada. And I just see a few people as I was looking around earlier on who have joined us. The Maynard Reeds in New York. Just happy for you joining us. And of course, our Sabbath School people, Tiff, I see Gwen. and others that I might miss. Just want to say a big thank you. And there's Dr. Ansa Fletcher from Loma Linda. I just want to say a big thank you for joining with us this evening. And before I pray, I'm going to ask, let me just pray, and then I ask Jen to come back on and talk about the prizes. Let me just say a thank you and a blessing prayer. Let's bow our heads together. Heavenly Father, we are thankful to you for the availability of knowledge and expertise. We're thankful to you for science that you have laid available to us to discover and to utilize. We're thankful for medicine and for what it has done to help us along the way. We've been through a lot of different types of pandemics over the years, and we have recounted some over time right here in our forum. And this one is being rampant, and it seems that it will overtake a lot of people before it's all over. So we ask that those give us this ability to make the right decision with respect to the vaccine, and help us to do the right things in terms of helping ourselves to be vigilant and to be protective, not only of ourselves, but others as we go forward. I pray a special blessing on Dr. Celeste, and for her time this evening. We really appreciate and ask, Lord, that you will continue to give her wisdom and her team and brothers or colleagues as they continue to do the best for the people of this nation. Thank you for hearing us. Thank you for the Sabbath day and the blessings we received today. And we ask, Lord, that you will keep us going forward. In the name of Jesus, I ask. Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Remember Brother Neil's funeral tomorrow.